want to share with you 4 points that marks the difference between the lost decade and the India Techade. In the lost decade, when you talked about telecom, when you talked about the telecom sector, you essentially talked only about scams. You talked about the 2G scam, you talked about the trunk exchange scam, you talked about how BSNL, which was a $6 billion company in 2004, had become a loss-making, significant liability on public exchequer by 2014. This was the characterization and this was what the lost decade meant vis-a-vis telecom. 2G scam के बारे में मैं ज़्यादा नहीं बोलूँगा, आप जानते ही हैं. There was crony capitalism, crony licensing, new phrases like first come first serve were invented instead of tenders. New analogies and ideologies and phraseologies like zero loss were invented during the last decade by a very senior lawyer come minister. तो ये सब था लॉस्ट डेकेड के टेलीकॉम सेक्टर के कैरेक्टरिस्टिक. और आज क्या हो रहा है, जैसे मैंने कहा, वी आर द फास्टेस्ट ग्रोइंग telecom connectivity nation in the world, the largest connected nation in the world. We have on multiple occasions auctioned spectrum, created licenses with absolute transparency, with absolute integrity. Every rupee that has been gained from the auction of spectrum has gone to the public exchequer and has been deployed in the expanded social spending schemes of the government of India. So that is one clear contrast I wanted to bring to your attention. The second sharp difference between the lost decade and the India Techade, between the UPA and the NDA, is how in that lost decade there was a flight of capital and the flight of foreign investors. You remember, and those of you who don't remember, who are too young to remember, and that is also a possibility, that telecom operators like Etisalat, Telenor, there were a large number of telecom international brand names that came, invested in India, and then had to run away from India because they were either, the businesses were destroyed, because of the corruption, because of the crony capitalism. That was the characteristic in the lost decade. और इंडिया टेकेड में आज ईज ऑफ बिजनेस के कारण, सरकार के रिफॉर्म्स के कारण आज एक स्टेबल, ग्रोइंग investor with great positive sentiment are rapidly investing into this sector and only growing the overall market capitalization and size of this segment in the digital economy. Third point, the last decade we were almost completely dependent on imports, whether they were equipment for the network or for devices that were used by consumers. और आज मैं आपके सामने, आप देख रहे होंगे कि मैं मंत्री हूँ, 3 फोन लेके घूमता हूँ, but I carry this with me because all 3 phones that I use are made in India. And this is again the big difference between the lost decade and the India Techade, where in the lost decade over 85 to 86% of all devices were imported, almost 100% of the equipment was imported, and today 100% of the devices are made, tested, assembled in India, exported from India to countries like North America, and in cutting edge areas like 5G, increasingly the value of Indian designed and Indian made components of the network infrastructure is growing from almost 0 to a higher percentage year on year. ये हो गया तीसरा point. Almost completely dependent on import to becoming more and more Atmanirbhar and made in India. Fourth, in the last decade, the consumers had constantly quality of service, dropped calls. I don't know how many of you remember again. पूरा का पूरा नैरेटिव होता था कि मेरे कॉल्स ड्रॉप हो रहे हैं, क्वालिटी ऑफ सर्विस के बारे में कोई सोच नहीं रहा है, सरकार नहीं, ट्राई नहीं, and this is always a debate between the consumer and the operator about why the consumers did not have any voice, the consumers did not have a right to quality service. In the India Techade, that whole equation has been turned 180 degrees. Networks are much higher quality today. Operators are incentivized and tasked with investing more and more base stations and capacities in the wireless networks. And even in the 5G, which we have launched as one of the few countries to have launched it, we are the second fastest rolled out 5G network in the world. And over 700 districts in India have already had 5G coverage. Over 500,000 base stations have been rolled out in this cutting edge technology. And we are already having a vision and a roadmap for 6G.